I lay suffocating in an intensive care unit with a collapsed lung while my mother enjoyed a hot stone massage. The trauma surgeon had spent 2 frantic hours begging her over the phone to sign emergency surgical consent forms to save my life just days before my 18th birthday. Her response was a crisp, annoyed sigh before she told him she was not leaving her luxury wellness retreat for routine paperwork and hung up. My grandmother drove 12 hours straight through the night and marched into the hospital with a lawyer to file for emergency medical custody. When my mother finally stormed into my room 48 hours later, it was not to check if I was breathing. She came because her platinum credit cards had just been frozen. She pointed a manicured finger at my grandmother and screamed that she could not do this. My name is Jada and I am 35 years old. Today, I manage wealth for some of the most powerful people in the country. But 17 years ago, my own life was entirely out of my control. The rhythmic, agonizing hiss of a hospital ventilator is a sound that permanently etches itself into your brain. I woke up to that mechanical breathing and the sharp, blinding agony of a chest tube protruding from my side. The fluorescent lights overhead felt like physical blows against my retinas as I tried to blink away the haze of heavy pain medication. I could not move my arms. I could barely turn my head. The raw memory of crunching metal shattering glass and the sheer terror of the car crash flooded my mind in disjointed flashes. I was 17 years old, exactly 2 days away from my 18th birthday, and I was completely entirely alone in a sterile room that smelled of bleach and copper. A trauma surgeon with dark circles under his eyes stood over my bed holding a thick metal clipboard. His face was drawn tight with a mixture of professional urgency and deep personal frustration. Beside him stood a hospital social worker clutching a tablet and looking at me with the kind of profound pity that makes your stomach turn. The doctor leaned over, checking the monitors, displaying my erratic vital signs. "You were in a severe collision, Jada," he said, his voice steady, but carrying an undercurrent of tension. "Your right lung collapsed upon impact and you suffered internal hemorrhaging. We had to perform immediate life-saving interventions to stabilize you, but your condition is extremely precarious. We need to perform a secondary procedure immediately to prevent fluid buildup from causing permanent tissue damage." I tried to speak, but the intubation tube blocked my vocal cords. I could only stare at him, my eyes wide with panic. The social worker stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on the edge of my bed. "Jada, you are legally a minor for another 48 hours, she explained softly. "We cannot proceed with the secondary surgery without parental consent. We have been trying to reach your mother Vivian for the past 2 hours. We called her cell phone, her office, her emergency contacts. We finally tracked her down through her assistant." The doctor gripped his clipboard so tightly his knuckles turned white. He did not offer any comforting platitudes or gentle reassurances. He simply reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and navigated to his voicemails. "I think you need to hear this so you understand the situation we are dealing with," he said, holding the speaker near my ear. "I hit play on the message that your mother left for the central nursing station after I personally explained the severity of your injuries to her." The audio began with the unmistakable soothing background music of a high-end spa. Then Vivian's voice rang out crisp, annoyed, and dripping with the kind of casual entitlement that defined the affluent social circles of Atlanta she so desperately clung to. "This is Vivian, and I am only leaving this message because my phone has not stopped buzzing for 2 hours. I am currently at an exclusive wellness retreat in Sedona, and I specifically instructed my assistant that I was not to be disturbed under any circumstances. I understand Jada had a little accident, but teenagers are resilient. I am absolutely not cutting my spiritual alignment weekend short to fly back across the country for routine medical paperwork. You are doctors, so figure it out. Give her whatever medication she needs and bill my insurance. I will be back on Tuesday as planned. Do not call this number again." The line clicked dead. The silence in the ICU room was deafening, broken only by the mechanical breathing of the ventilator keeping me alive. The doctor put his phone away, his jaw set in a hard line. "Your mother refused to fax a proxy consent form," he stated flatly. "She refused to authorize a verbal consent recording. She told the charge nurse that she paid too much for her deep tissue therapy to deal with teenage drama. We have hospital administrators currently consulting with the legal department to see if we can invoke implied emergency consent, but because you are stable at this exact second, the lawyers are stalling. They are afraid of a lawsuit from your mother if we operate without a signature. I lay there, trapped in a broken body, unable to scream, unable to cry out the pure, unadulterated rage building in my chest. My mother had always treated me as an inconvenience, a disappointing stain on her perfectly curated life. She spent her days attending charity galas at the country club, wearing designer clothes bought with money my late father had supposedly left behind, while I wore hand-me-downs and worked data entry shifts after high school to afford my own college applications. My younger sister Chloe was the golden child, the one being groomed for high society, while I was the invisible burden. But leaving me to suffocate on a hospital bed, because it interrupted her spa weekend, was a level of betrayal that shattered whatever fragile illusion of family I still harbored. The social worker looked at the doctor, her voice dropping to an anxious whisper. If we wait for a court order to bypass the mother, we are looking at a minimum of 24 hours. By then, the fluid accumulation in her chest cavity could cause permanent respiratory failure. We are tied up in bureaucratic red tape because the mother explicitly denied authorization on a recorded line. It is a legal nightmare. I closed my eyes, feeling a cold, terrifying darkness creeping in at the edges of my vision. The pain in my chest was intensifying, a sharp, burning sensation that flared with every mechanical breath forced into my lungs. I was going to die in this room because the woman who gave birth to me valued a hot stone massage over my life. I prepared myself for the end, letting the anger settle into a hard, icy knot in the center of my being. I promised myself that if I somehow survived this, I would never shed another tear for Vivian again. Suddenly, the heavy double doors of the intensive care unit did not just open, they burst apart with a violent crash. The monitors around me began to beep frantically in response to the sudden spike in my heart rate. The doctor spun around, ready to reprimand whoever was causing a disturbance in the critical care ward. But the reprimand died in his throat as a woman marched into the room carrying the kind of undeniable authority that commanded absolute silence. It was not Vivian. My grandmother Loretta strode into the room, her heels clicking sharply against the linoleum floor. She was 70 years old, dressed in an immaculate charcoal suit, her silver hair pulled back into a severe bun. She had driven 12 hours straight from Atlanta, the moment a sympathetic nurse broke protocol and called her directly. Loretta did not come alone. Flanking her was a tall, broad-shouldered man, holding a thick leather briefcase, who radiated the cold, calculating energy of a high-powered litigator. Loretta did not waste time with tearful greetings or emotional breakdowns. She walked straight to the end of my bed, looked at the doctor, and spoke in a voice that brooked absolutely no opposition. "My name is Loretta, and I am this child's paternal grandmother. My lawyer has just filed an emergency petition for medical custody with the family court judge, who happens to owe me a significant favor. As of 10 minutes ago, Vivian has been legally stripped of all parental rights regarding Jada's medical and financial welfare. Hand me the damn consent forms right now, before I buy this hospital and fire everyone in it for letting my granddaughter suffer." The doctor blinked clearly, taken aback by the sheer force of her presence. The social worker quickly stepped forward, stammering about hospital policy and the necessity of verifying the court documents. Loretta did not even look at the social worker. She simply snapped her fingers, and the lawyer stepped forward, slamming a stack of papers onto the doctor's clipboard. "The ink on the judge's signature is still wet," the lawyer stated, his tone dangerously smooth. "The order grants Loretta immediate temporary guardianship, which will seamlessly transition into permanent emancipation when Jada turns 18 on Thursday. If you delay this necessary surgical procedure for one more second, we will sue this institution for gross medical negligence." The doctor quickly scanned the documents, a look of profound relief washing over his tired features. He immediately handed Loretta a pen. "Sign here, here, and here," he instructed, pointing to the highlighted sections. "We can move her to the operating room in 5 minutes." Loretta signed the papers with aggressive slashing strokes. She walked over to the side of my bed, placing a warm, steady hand against my uninjured cheek. Her eyes met mine, fiercely protective and blazing with unspoken promises. "You rest now, baby girl," she whispered, leaning close so only I could hear. "I have got you. Vivian is never touching a single aspect of your life again. That is a promise." The medication hit my IV line a few seconds later, dragging me down into a deep, dreamless sleep. When I finally woke up, the agonizing pressure in my chest was gone, replaced by the dull, throbbing ache of a successful surgery. The ventilator had been removed, and I was breathing on my own, drawing in shallow but steady breaths of hospital air. The room was quiet, the chaotic energy of the previous day, replaced by the steady rhythmic beeping of my heart monitor. I turned my head slowly and saw Loretta sitting in a chair by the window, reading a thick financial report. She looked up immediately, catching my movement. She set the paperwork down and moved to my bedside, offering a small, reassuring smile. "You are going to be just fine, Jada," she said, pouring a small cup of water and holding the straw to my dry lips. "The surgeon said your lung capacity will return to normal with proper physical therapy. We are going to have you out of here and back home to Atlanta before the end of the week." I took a small sip of water, wincing as my throat protested. "Thank you," I rasped, my voice sounding like crushed gravel. "You saved me." She shook her head, her expression hardening. "You saved yourself by fighting hard enough to stay alive until I got here. Now we have another fight ahead of us because your mother just landed at the airport and she is on the warpath." Before I could even process that information, the ICU doors flew open again. Vivian stormed into the room, her face contorted in a mask of absolute fury. She was wearing a designer silk blouse and large, expensive sunglasses pushed up into her perfectly highlighted hair. She did not look at me. She did not ask how the surgery went. She did not ask if I was in pain. She marched straight toward Loretta, pointing a French manicured finger directly at my grandmother's face. "What the hell do you think you are doing, Loretta?" Vivian screamed, her voice echoing shrilly off the hospital walls. I was standing at the checkout counter of the Sedona Wellness Lodge trying to pay my bill, and my platinum cards were declined. All of them. I had to endure the utter humiliation of calling my bank from the lobby, only to be told that the primary accounts were locked. The bank manager said some insane court order had frozen my assets because of a custody dispute over Jada. "You call your lawyer and fix this right now, or I swear I will have you arrested for theft." Loretta stood up slowly, smoothing out the front of her suit. She did not raise her voice, which only made her response more devastating. "You are yelling in an intensive care unit where your daughter just had her chest sliced open, Vivian. Have you entirely lost whatever shred of decency you had left? I filed for emergency medical custody to save Jada's life because you refused to leave a spa. And yes, that emergency filing automatically triggered a hard freeze on the survivor benefits account that Calvin established for Jada's care. The account you have been using as your personal slush fund for the past 10 years to buy designer clothes and fund vacations for you and Chloe." Vivian scoffed, crossing her arms over her chest defensively. "I am her mother. I have the right to manage those funds as I see fit. The cost of maintaining our social standing in Atlanta is astronomical, and Jada never needed that kind of money anyway. She is fine working her little data entry jobs. You had no right to freeze those accounts." Loretta took a step closer, narrowing her eyes. "I had every right. Calvin explicitly stated in the trust documents that the money was for Jada's upbringing and education. The moment you proved yourself an unfit parent by denying her life-saving medical care, the bank was legally obligated to halt all withdrawals until a thorough audit could be conducted. You are cut off, Vivian. The free ride is completely over. You will not see another dime of my son's money." Vivian threw her head back and let out a harsh, mocking laugh that made my stomach churn. She looked at Loretta with an expression of pure, unfiltered disdain. "You think you are so smart, old woman. You think you have finally beaten me. Let me tell you a little secret about your precious dead son. Calvin died completely bankrupt. He lost everything in bad real estate investments right before his heart gave out. That survivor account you just froze. It only had a few $1,000s left in it anyway. You just locked an empty vault. Vivian finally turned her attention to me, looking at my bruised and battered body with cold, calculating eyes. You always were a massive inconvenience, Jada, she sneered. I hope you and your grandmother enjoy each other's company, because you are officially cut out of my house. Do not expect me to pay a single cent of this hospital bill. Loretta can handle the debt since she loves playing the hero so much. Vivian spun on her heel, clutching her designer bag tightly. Have a nice life, she threw over her shoulder before walking out the doors, the sharp click of her heels fading down the hallway. The silence returned heavy with the weight of her final cruel words. I stared at the ceiling, feeling a strange, hollow emptiness where my grief should have been. The anger had burned out, leaving only cold, hard resolution. She threw me away for nothing, I whispered, my voice cracking. She said Dad left nothing. Loretta walked back to my bedside. Her face was completely calm, completely devoid of the panic Vivian had tried to inflict. She reached into the pocket of her tailored suit jacket and pulled out a heavy antique brass key. She placed the cold metal directly into my palm, closing my fingers tightly around it. Vivian has always been blinded by appearances. Loretta whispered, a sharp, knowing smile touching the corners of her mouth. She only ever looked at the checking accounts. She only ever cared about the cash she could spend immediately at the country club. She never bothered to look deeper. Your father was many things, Jada. He was complicated, he was secretive, and he made plenty of mistakes. But he was incredibly smart, and he was never ever broke. I looked down at the brass key resting in my hand, the metal warm against my skin. What does this open? I asked, my heart suddenly pounding with a new, entirely different kind of adrenaline. Loretta leaned back, her eyes shining with quiet, fierce anticipation. It opens the door to your real inheritance, Jada. The one Vivian knows absolutely nothing about. The one we are going to use to build you an empire that will make her choke on her own arrogance. Now rest up. We have a lot of work to do. 2 weeks later, I walked out of that hospital with a slight limp and a permanent jagged scar carved across my ribs. I did not return to the sprawling suburban fortress I grew up in. I moved straight into Grandma Loretta's brick ranch house in South Fulton. Vivian never called to check if my lungs were functioning. She simply acted like I had died on that operating table. But I saw exactly how she mourned my absence. I saw it parked right in our old driveway when Loretta drove me by to pick up my remaining winter coats. It was a brand new silver Mercedes-Benz coupe with a massive red bow plastered on the hood. Chloe was standing in the front yard posing for pictures in a designer sundress. Vivian was adjusting Chloe's hair loudly, bragging to the neighbors about her perfect golden child, heading off to Spelman College in the fall, fully funded and flawless. Vivian caught sight of Loretta's ancient sedan idling at the curb. She did not look at me. She looked right through me. She walked over to the passenger window, tapped her manicured fingernails against the glass, and handed Loretta a black garbage bag stuffed with my clothes. She said Chloe needed my old room for her expanding college wardrobe. She told Loretta that since I was an adult now, my state college tuition and my massive medical bills were entirely my own problem. She flipped her hair, smiled at the neighbors, and walked away. I did not shed a single tear. I took that garbage bag, and I weaponized my anger. While Chloe drove her luxury car to Spelman and attended exclusive Atlanta socialite mixers, I rode 2 city buses to a local state college. I took the night shift at a data entry firm downtown, working from midnight until 8 in the morning. My hands blistered from typing alphanumeric codes for 8 hours straight while my coworkers slept at their desks. I sat in a cramped cubicle surrounded by peeling gray walls and buzzing fluorescent lights. But I did not just enter data passively. I watched the money flow across the screen. I studied where the funds moved, how the corporate accounts linked together, and why certain offshore numbers never added up. I started finding massive discrepancies in my own employer's ledgers just for practice. I switched my major to forensic accounting the very next day. Every corporate tax loophole, Every offshore shelter, every hidden asset trick became my absolute obsession. I spent my weekends reading federal tax codes like they were thriller novels. I learned the precise language of liars and thieves because I knew my mother spoke it fluently. 4 grueling years passed. I fueled myself on caffeine and sheer spite. The day I graduated with top honors, I was still working a second job as a waitress at an upscale restaurant in Buckhead to pay for my professional certification exams. I was clearing a table when Vivian and Chloe walked in. Chloe was wearing a dress that cost more than my monthly rent, and she was holding hands with Preston. He was a wealthy white real estate developer from a notoriously elitist family, known for buying up historically black neighborhoods and gentrifying them into oblivion. Vivian flagged me down, snapping her fingers to demand extra lemon for her sparkling water. She looked at my stained apron and smirked. She turned to Preston and sighed loudly. "This is my estranged daughter Jada," she announced, making sure the surrounding tables could hear. It is a shame she never applied herself. She was always destined for manual labor while our Chloe was born for the boardroom. Preston let out a patronizing chuckle, adjusting his expensive watch. He told me to fetch the lemon quickly, because they had an important real estate gala to attend. I did not fetch the lemon. I placed my serving tray on their table with a loud crack. I looked at Vivian's expensive handbag and the new lines of severe financial stress around her eyes. I told her that her credit cards were currently maxing out at a dangerous 30% interest rate, and that her designer bag was a cheap counterfeit. I knew because I had audited the fraudulent boutique she bought it from just last week. I turned to Chloe and congratulated her on securing a man who needed his father's trust fund to pay for his overpriced appetizers. Vivian turned pale and threatened to have me fired on the spot. I untied my apron, dropped it directly onto Preston's lap, and walked out the front door. I had my degree. I was permanently done serving them. I packed my 2 suitcases and bought a one-way ticket to Chicago. I left the toxic, suffocating socialite circles of Atlanta far behind me. The biting cold wind of the Midwest matched the absolute ice in my veins. I built my boutique wealth management firm from the ground up, relying on nobody but myself. I started small by uncovering massive embezzlement schemes in mid-level tech companies. I would walk into boardrooms full of older, arrogant men, throw a single ledger on the table, and watch them sweat as I dismantled their entire financial lives in under 5 minutes. Word spread rapidly about the young, ruthless black accountant who could track a missing dollar through a dozen international borders and completely bankrupt a fraudulent corporation before lunch. Within 5 years, I was managing 9-figure portfolios for high-profile CEOs who trusted me more than they trusted their own board of directors. My office occupied the top floor of a sleek glass skyscraper overlooking Lake Michigan. I employed 20 junior analysts who hung on my every word. I wore custom-tailored suits that cost more than Chloe's entire Spelman tuition. I bought a penthouse in cash. I became financially untouchable. I created an impenetrable fortress of wealth and security where nobody could ever leave me stranded and suffocating again. I traded the desperate need for familial love for absolute, undeniable power, and I was perfectly fine with that transaction. It was a rainy Tuesday morning when the past finally caught up with me. My lead financial analyst walked into my office looking visibly shaken and dropped a thick, heavily redacted corporate audit file onto my mahogany desk. We were vetting a massive commercial real estate acquisition for a new client. The analyst told me the numbers were a complete chaotic disaster. He said there was a massive anonymous shell company bleeding the parent corporation dry through fabricated land leases and phantom development projects. He pointed to a series of offshore transfers that were designed to look like legitimate construction expenses, but were actually funneling millions into a private trust. I opened the heavy file and scanned the banking routing numbers, the tax identification codes, and the attached property deeds. My blood ran completely cold, spreading a familiar, icy rage through my veins. The shell company was not operating out of some distant tax haven. It was operating out of a very specific local zip code. It was my exact hometown in Atlanta. and the primary signature on the fraudulent commercial land deeds hiding behind layers of corporate red tape belonged to someone I knew entirely too well. I traced my finger over the signature on the fraudulent commercial lease agreement sitting on my desk. It was Vivian's looping, pretentious handwriting. She was illegally authorizing land developments through a shell corporation. I did not call my legal team. I did not ask for a secondary review. I booked a first-class ticket to Atlanta. I needed to see the physical proof. I carried the heavy antique brass key Grandma Loretta had pressed into my palm 17 years ago. Loretta had passed away 3 years prior, leaving me everything she had. But that key had always been the ultimate mystery. She told me to use it only when I was powerful enough to protect what was inside. Today, I was untouchable. I walked into the First National Bank of Atlanta, wearing a custom-tailored charcoal suit that screamed hostile takeover. The bank manager, an older man named Mr. Sterling, who regularly attended Vivian's country club charity dinners, recognized me immediately. He offered a tight, condescending smile. "Jada," he said, leaning back in his leather chair. "We have not seen you in Atlanta for a very long time. Your mother mentioned you were still doing administrative work up north. What can I help you with today?" I did not sit down. I dropped a certified judicial order directly onto his desk. "I am the sole managing director of Apex Wealth Management and the legal executor of Calvin's remaining trust," I stated, my voice perfectly level. "I demand immediate access to safety deposit box 412. Mr. Sterling balked, his condescending smile vanishing. "Now hold on a minute, Jada. Your mother Vivian is the primary on all family accounts. I cannot simply grant you access to a secured vault without her explicit written authorization. It is a matter of bank policy and family protocol." I leaned over his desk, planting my hands flat on the polished mahogany. "I am not asking for a favor, Mr. Sterling. I am executing a federal court order. If you delay my access for one more second, I will have my legal team file a massive injunction against this branch for obstructing a federal audit. I will personally ensure the Banking Commission investigates every single offshore transfer you have quietly authorized for my mother's fraudulent shell companies over the past 5 years. Shall I dial my lead attorney, or are we going to the vault?" He swallowed hard, his face draining of color. He grabbed his master keys and stood up without another word. He escorted me down to the vault, his hands shaking slightly as he unlocked the secondary mechanism. I stepped inside the cold steel room and slid Grandma Loretta's brass key into the lock. The metal box was heavy. I carried it to the private viewing table and opened the lid. Inside, there were no stacks of cash or shiny gold bars. There was a thick sealed manila envelope and a handwritten letter from my father. I set the letter aside, knowing I needed to read it when my blood was not boiling. I unfolded the crisp legal documents first. They were the original ironclad deeds to a massive stretch of commercial real estate on the west side of Atlanta. Vivian had always mocked this specific property. She called it Calvin's toxic dump, an abandoned industrial wasteland that was completely worthless. She used it as her favorite dinner party anecdote to prove my father was a financial failure. She told all her wealthy friends that Calvin had squandered their fortune on useless dirt. But Vivian was entirely too arrogant to ever read municipal city planning reports. I pulled up the private zoning files on my encrypted tablet right there in the bank vault. The city had secretly rezoned that exact stretch of land 2 years ago for a multi-million-dollar tech innovation hub. The property Vivian thought was worth pennies was now the absolute most valuable undeveloped commercial real estate in Fulton County. And my father had placed the deeds entirely in an irrevocable trust under my name. Vivian did not own a single blade of grass on that property. I pulled out my phone and dialed my lead analyst in Chicago. "Marcus," I said the moment he answered. "I need you to cross-reference the shell company from the audit. Who is Vivian leasing the land to?" I hear the rapid clacking of a keyboard on the other end of the line. "Give me 1 second," he said. "Okay. I am looking at the corporate filings now. The shell company is leasing the development rights to a firm called Vanguard Properties." Who owns Vanguard Properties? I demanded. Marcus paused. A guy named Preston. His family firm specializes in high-end commercial gentrification. But there is a massive red flag here, Jada. Preston's firm is highly leveraged. They are bleeding cash and facing potential bankruptcy. This new tech hub project on your father's land is their absolute last lifeline. They are betting their entire corporate survival on breaking ground this month. A cold, predatory smile spread across my face. Vivian was selling development rights to land she did not own to a developer who was secretly broke. They were building a massive house of cards on my property. Thank you, Marcus, I said. Lock down the audit. Do not let anyone else see those files. I packed the original deeds and my father's letter into my secure briefcase and walked out of the bank, leaving Mr. Sterling sweating nervously at his desk. I flew back to Chicago that same afternoon. The pieces of the puzzle were finally fitting together, but I needed to know exactly how Vivian and Preston were planning to bypass the legal ownership of the land. I walked into my penthouse, dropping my keys on the marble counter. My assistant had left my daily mail sorted on the kitchen island. Sitting right on top of the pile was a thick, cream-colored envelope. The calligraphy was painfully extravagant, screaming of new money and desperate social climbing. I tore the wax seal open. It was a wedding invitation. Chloe, the undisputed golden child, was getting married. The groom was Preston, the very same arrogant white real estate developer from the restaurant in Buckhead all those years ago. The guy who had laughed at my waitress apron and told me to fetch his lemon. Chloe was marrying the man whose entire financial survival depended on stealing my land. Tucked inside the heavy embossed invitation was a handwritten note on Vivian's personal stationery. The note did not say she missed me. It did not ask how I was doing. It was a direct, unapologetic demand. Jada, I expect you to attend your sister's rehearsal dinner this Friday at the country club in Atlanta. Do not wear your cheap office clothes, and do not embarrass us. I have also enclosed a standard family waiver regarding your father's old worthless property lines on the west side. Preston needs it signed immediately to clear up a minor clerical error for his new development project. Sign the waiver and bring it as your wedding gift to your sister. If you refuse to sign it, do not bother showing up to the wedding at all. I read the note twice. The sheer audacity of the demand was breathtaking. They actually thought I was still the invisible, naive girl they had kicked to the curb. They thought I was a desperate charity case who would blindly sign away a multi-million-dollar property just for the privilege of sitting in the back row of Chloe's wedding. They had absolutely no idea that I was the forensic accountant who had just audited their entire fraudulent existence. I picked up the enclosed quitclaim deed. It was drafted to look like a meaningless administrative form, burying the true parcel numbers deep in the legal jargon. Preston was trying to trick me into signing away my birthright so he could save his failing company, and Vivian was using my sister's wedding as the bait. I did not throw the invitation away. I placed the fraudulent quitclaim deed back into the envelope alongside my father's original ironclad land deeds. I walked over to my closet and pulled out a custom-tailored suit that cost more than Vivian's entire catering budget. I was going to fly back to Atlanta. I was going to attend that rehearsal dinner, and I was going to absolutely destroy them. The valet at the Peachtree Elite Country Club rushed forward to open the door of my hired black car. I stepped out onto the pristine cobblestone driveway, letting the warm, humid Atlanta evening air wash over me. I was not the terrified 17-year-old girl lying helpless in an intensive care unit anymore. I was a 35-year-old apex predator walking directly into a cage full of incredibly fragile and financially desperate prey. My suit was a custom-tailored masterpiece of midnight blue silk and fine wool. It was completely unbranded, representing a level of silent wealth that easily cost 3 times the budget Vivian had scraped together for this entire rehearsal dinner. I adjusted my cuffs and walked through the heavy oak double doors of the club. The marble foyer echoed with the sharp, confident click of my stiletto heels. The scent of fresh orchids and old money hung thick in the air, but underneath it, I could smell the distinct stench of Vivian's desperation. She was hovering near the coat check, pacing back and forth like a nervous bird trapped in a glass room. She was wearing a dress that screamed of maxed-out department store credit cards, and her neck was draped in cubic zirconia, attempting to pass as family heirlooms. The moment she spotted me, her fake socialite smile instantly dropped into a scowl of pure, unfiltered panic. She did not say hello. She did not welcome me. She practically lunged across the foyer, grabbing my elbow hard to physically pull me out of sight of the arriving guests. She shoved a cheap plastic garment bag directly into my chest. Inside the plastic was a horrific pastel pink dress with a clearance tag still visible dangling from the zipper. "Put this on right now in the ladies' room," Vivian hissed, her fingers digging painfully into the fabric of my custom sleeve. "You are not walking into my future son-in-law's rehearsal dinner wearing a men's business suit. You look like a glorified office clerk who just got off a double shift." Preston's family is old Southern money, Jada. They are highly conservative, and they are completely funding this entire evening because your sister is marrying into royalty. I will not let your sad, desperate cry for attention humiliate Chloe in front of the people who actually matter in this city. I looked down at the plastic bag resting against my silk lapel. I did not flinch. I did not get angry. I did not shrink back into the abused teenager she desperately wanted me to be. I simply reached up, calmly removed her hands from my jacket, and took the plastic bag. I walked 2 steps over to the heavy brass trash receptacle standing next to the coat check counter and dropped the dress directly into the garbage. The plastic made a loud, satisfying thud as it hit the bottom. Vivian gasped loudly, her manicured hand flying to her chest in absolute shock. "What is wrong with you?" she shrieked, keeping her voice in a harsh whisper so the valet staff would not hear. "That dress cost me $200. I bought that specifically so you would not look like a complete charity case sitting in the corner. I am trying to save you from embarrassing yourself in front of billionaires." "Vivian," I said, my voice projecting clearly and calmly across the empty space of the foyer. My suit was tailored in Milan, and it cost significantly more than the down payment on the car you currently lease. Do not ever hand me discount polyester again and expect me to wear it. I stepped past her, walking deliberately toward the grand directory board positioned in the center of the lobby. I read the gold lettering tracing my finger over the events listed for the evening. By the way, I have to say I am incredibly impressed. I continued, turning back to face her with a bright, razor-sharp smile. I am genuinely shocked you managed to secure the Magnolia Room for tonight. It is a very cute secondary dining space, very quaint. A bit cramped for a rehearsal dinner, but perfect if you are on a strict budget. Vivian turned an ugly mottled shade of red, her neck flushing with instant defensiveness. "The Magnolia Room is perfectly elegant," she snapped, adjusting her fake pearls. "We specifically requested it because we wanted an intimate setting for the two families to bond. Preston's mother prefers a cozy atmosphere over something gaudy. We are prioritizing class over size, Jada, but you would not understand anything about class living alone in your little apartment doing data entry." "Of course you prioritized intimacy," I replied, stepping directly into her personal space, forcing her to take a step back. "Because the main grand ballroom requires a mandatory $75,000 cash deposit up front. I know that exact figure, because my firm, Apex Wealth Management, booked the grand ballroom entirely for our regional corporate retreat next month." Vivian froze, her eyes darting across my face, searching for a lie. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. "The country club manager, Richard, was actually very apologetic to me on the phone yesterday afternoon." I continued, my tone entirely conversational, as I delivered the financial kill shot. "Richard told me he had to shove a low-tier wedding rehearsal into the overflow room, just to accommodate our massive catering setup in the main hall. He complained that the mother of the bride was a nightmare who tried to negotiate the champagne prices down to wholesale. It is so fascinating to discover that the cheap nightmare he was complaining about was actually you, Vivian." Vivian's jaw practically unhinged. The haughty, arrogant facade she had spent decades building shattered completely in a matter of seconds. She stared at me, realizing that the daughter she thought was a broke failure was casually dropping names and numbers that she could only dream of touching. She opened her mouth to scream a response, to demand I leave to call security, but the words completely died in her throat. Before she could form a single syllable of retaliation, a shrill, forced laugh echoed from the main hallway. Chloe and Preston were approaching us from the dining room, blissfully unaware of the absolute destruction I had just unleashed. Chloe draped herself over Preston like a desperate accessory. She wore a white silk slip dress that clung to her frame so tightly it restricted her breathing, signaling to everyone in the room that she was the bride and the undisputed center of the universe. Preston stood beside her, radiating an aura of unearned arrogance. He wore a velvet dinner jacket that looked expensive from a distance, but the stitching on the lapel betrayed it as an off-the-rack purchase tailored to look bespoke. He flashed a smarmy, practiced smile. He looked exactly like the kind of man who would leverage a century-old family business into the ground just to maintain the illusion of absolute wealth. They stepped right past Vivian, who was still staring at me in mute horror by the coat check. Chloe did not even notice our mother's sudden inability to speak. She was entirely too focused on sizing me up. I watched her eyes track over my midnight blue suit, searching for a cheap label or a poorly constructed hem. When she found none, her smile tightened just a fraction, revealing the deep insecurity she had carried since childhood. "Jada," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "You actually showed up. I am honestly surprised you could get the time off work. I know those hourly administrative jobs are incredibly strict about vacation days." Preston chuckled, a low, patronizing sound that vibrated in his chest. He extended a hand toward me, adorned with a flashy, oversized dive watch. I recognized the watch immediately. It was a replica. A very good replica, but a fake nonetheless. A man managing a successful real estate empire would wear a genuine Patek Philippe, not a counterfeit piece of metal desperately trying to catch the light. "Jada, right?" he said smoothly. "We met years ago at that steakhouse in Buckhead. You were wearing an apron, if I recall correctly. It is good to see you again. Tell me, are you still doing data entry up in Chicago to make ends meet? There is no shame in honest manual labor. My grandfather always used to say, the people at the bottom of the ladder build the strongest character for the rest of us to stand on." I did not take his extended hand. I simply looked at his palm, then looked slowly up into his eyes. His confident smile faltered for a microsecond before he quickly pulled his hand back, pretending to adjust his velvet cuff to cover his embarrassment. Chloe laughed, a high, piercing sound designed to draw the attention of the surrounding country club guests. "Oh, Preston, do not tease her. Jada is our little family charity case. We are just thrilled she managed to scrape together enough pennies to afford a budget airline ticket down here. Vivian was so worried you would show up in your dreadful office clerk clothes, Jada. We really did not want you to feel out of place among people of our caliber." I glanced over at Vivian, who had backed away toward the lavish floral arrangements, looking like she was about to hyperventilate. She knew the terrifying truth about my firm booking the grand ballroom, but she was too paralyzed by fear to warn her precious golden child. Vivian was trapped in a nightmare of her own making, completely unable to stop the collision course her daughter was currently accelerating toward. "I suggest you head over to the secondary dining room," Chloe continued, waving her hand dismissively toward the back of the venue near the kitchen swinging doors. "We put together a special tableway in the back for the distant cousins and the plus ones who could not afford to bring a wedding gift. You will fit right in back there. Make sure you do not bother Preston's family. They are old Atlanta royalty, and they do not really know how to interact with the working class. We want tonight to be perfectly elegant." I did not argue with her. I did not raise my voice or defend my career. I flagged down a passing waiter holding a silver tray and picked up a crystal flute of champagne. I took a slow, deliberate sip, savoring the dry, crisp taste of the vintage wine. The absolute serenity I felt in that internal moment was intoxicating. I was standing in front of a man who was secretly drowning in corporate debt and a sister who genuinely thought she was marrying a billionaire. I held their entire financial existence inside the slim leather briefcase resting quietly by my feet. "That sounds perfect, Chloe," I said, my voice perfectly level and calm. "I absolutely love watching things unfold from the back of the room. You see so much more of the truth when people think you are not paying attention to the details." Chloe rolled her eyes, turning her back to me, completely dismissing my presence. "Come on, Preston," she murmured, tugging his arm forcefully. "Let us go mingle with the Sterling family. I cannot waste my energy on her tonight. We have important guests to entertain." Preston offered me one last patronizing wink before turning his attention to the wealthy crowd. But he did not just mingle. He guided Chloe to the center of the room, stepping up onto the small, elevated mahogany platform designated for speeches. He tapped a silver spoon against his crystal champagne flute. The sharp ringing sound cut through the low hum of conversation. The room quieted down immediately. The wealthy elite of Atlanta turned their collective attention to the handsome groom, expecting a heartwarming traditional speech about his beautiful bride. Preston cleared his throat, adjusting his velvet jacket and puffing out his chest. "Family and friends," he began, his voice echoing across the high vaulted ceilings of the country club. "We are gathered here tonight to celebrate love. We are here to celebrate the magnificent union of two incredible families. But tonight is also about celebrating the future. My future with my stunning bride Chloe, and the undisputed future of my family's historic legacy." He paused for dramatic effect, smiling broadly out at the crowd of socialites, bankers, and real estate investors. I watched him, carefully analyzing his body language from the shadows. He was sweating slightly at the temples. His knuckles were white, showing that his grip on his champagne flute was entirely too tight. He was a desperate man, putting on a theatrical performance for his anxious creditors. Many of you in this room know that Vanguard Properties has been searching for a signature project. Preston continued, his voice swelling with artificial pride. "A massive project that will completely redefine the economic landscape of this beautiful city. For months there have been whispers and rumors about what our next big aggressive move would be. Tonight I am thrilled to officially announce to our closest friends that we have secured the most lucrative commercial development deal in the history of our firm." A loud murmur of excitement rippled through the well-dressed crowd. I took another slow sip of my champagne, my eyes locked onto Vivian. She was standing frozen near the private bar, her face completely ashen. She knew exactly what Preston was about to say, and she knew she had authorized it illegally behind layers of fraudulent paperwork. "We are breaking ground next week on a massive state-of-the-art technology hub," Preston boasted, raising his glass higher to the ceiling. "We are taking a forgotten, abandoned industrial zone and transforming it into a multi-million-dollar innovation center. It will bring thousands of high-paying jobs and millions in revenue directly to the city of Atlanta." After months of brutal negotiations, we have officially secured the exclusive development rights to the entire West Side district along the old riverfront. He proudly named the exact zoning district and recited the specific parcel numbers to the crowd to prove his absolute victory. The room erupted into thunderous applause. Preston's father slapped him on the back, looking incredibly relieved that their family business was saved. The wealthy investors in the room raised their glasses, cheering loudly for a financial victory that would supposedly secure their lucrative portfolios for the next decade. Preston beamed, pulling Chloe in for a deep kiss while the room celebrated his real estate genius. Chloe looked out at the crowd with a triumphant smile, firmly believing she was now the queen of Atlanta high society. Preston pulled back and pointed his crystal glass directly toward Vivian. "And I have to give a special dedicated toast to my incredible future mother-in-law, Vivian," he announced loudly, ensuring every single person in the room heard him clearly. Vivian had the brilliant, relentless vision to partner with Vanguard Properties. She masterfully navigated the complex family trusts, and she personally provided us with the exclusive commercial leases to make this incredible dream a reality. We could not have done this without her signature. To Vivian and to our glorious future together. The crowd turned and applauded Vivian enthusiastically. She did not smile. She looked like she was standing blindfolded in front of a firing squad. Her eyes darted wildly around the room, searching for an escape route, before finally locking directly onto me, standing in the shadows. I stood perfectly still near the back of the room, holding my champagne flute. The specific district Preston had just proudly named to a room full of the most powerful and influential people in Atlanta was sitting entirely on my father's deeded land. The exact original land deeds that were currently resting securely inside my briefcase next to the fraudulent quitclaim deed Vivian had demanded I sign. Preston had just publicly confessed to a multi-million-dollar commercial development fraud. Furthermore, he had just publicly and enthusiastically implicated Vivian as his primary co-conspirator in front of every major banking executive in the city. I raised my glass, making direct, unblinking eye contact with Vivian, across the crowded room. I offered her a slow, chilling smile. The trap was perfectly set. The steel jaws were primed and ready to snap shut. And I was going to enjoy every single miserable second of the absolute financial bloodbath that was about to follow. The applause finally dissolved into the polite ambient hum of old money pretending to be civilized. Waiters in immaculate white dinner jackets flooded the cramped Magnolia room, moving with military precision to deliver the first course. I remained at my assigned seat at table 14, positioned perfectly in the absolute back corner of the room, directly next to the swinging kitchen doors. My dining companions were exactly who Chloe promised they would be. A great aunt who had been cut out of the primary trust fund decades ago, a bewildered cousin from out of state, and two corporate plus ones who looked like they wanted to be anywhere else. I did not engage in small talk. I simply sat back in my velvet chair, acting as a silent observer to the financial autopsy happening before my eyes. I watched Vivian at the head table. She was completely unable to touch the artisanal burrata and heirloom tomato salad placed in front of her. Her hands were shaking. She reached for her wine glass, gripping the delicate crystal stem so tightly I expected it to snap. She had seen my smile from across the room. She knew I held the winning hand, but her narcissistic brain was desperately trying to rewire the narrative. In Vivian's world, reality was entirely malleable. If you spoke a lie loudly enough to enough wealthy people, it magically became the truth. She needed to reassert her dominance. She needed to publicly neutralize me before I could unravel her fraudulent real estate conspiracy. She picked up a heavy silver spoon and struck the side of her crystal wine glass. The sharp, piercing sound cut through the low chatter of the room, instantly commanding the attention of the Atlanta elite. Vivian stood up, smoothing down the front of her desperately expensive dress. She signaled to the event coordinator, who quickly handed her a wireless microphone. She stepped out from behind the head table, moving to the center of the room. The spotlight shifted, catching the fake diamonds draped around her neck. She inhaled deeply, pasting on a serene maternal smile that belonged on a daytime soap opera. Family, esteemed guests, and cherished friends. Vivian began, her voice dripping with artificial southern charm. We are so incredibly blessed to have you all here tonight in this intimate, beautiful space to celebrate the joining of two magnificent bloodlines. When I look at my beautiful Chloe and the remarkable Preston, I do not just see a young couple in love. I see the absolute pinnacle of Atlanta society. I see pedigree. I see breeding. I see two people destined to uphold the legacy of the Vanguard Properties empire. She paused, allowing the room to offer a polite round of applause. Preston puffed out his chest while Chloe beamed, gripping his arm tighter. We all know how difficult it is to maintain standards in today's world. Vivian continued, her voice dropping an octave, adopting a tone of faux philosophical sadness. It takes dedication. It takes sacrifice. It takes an unwavering commitment to your family's core values. And tragically, not everyone possesses that kind of character. Not everyone has the stamina to carry the weight of a distinguished family name. The atmosphere in the room shifted immediately. The polite smiles of the banking executives and socialites began to freeze. They sensed the sudden pivot in Vivian's tone. The warm rehearsal dinner toast was rapidly transforming into something incredibly uncomfortable. Old money despised public emotional displays, and Vivian was crossing a massive, invisible line. Vivian turned her body directly toward the back of the room. The spotlight followed her gaze, illuminating table 14. It illuminated me. Many of you know that Chloe has a sister, Vivian said, her voice echoing through the speakers loaded with toxic synthetic pity. Many of you have politely avoided asking about her for years, out of respect for my broken heart. But tonight, as a testament to the forgiving nature of this family, we have allowed her to join us. Jada, please stand up so everyone can see you. I did not stand. I did not avert my eyes. I sat perfectly still, my posture immaculate, calmly resting my hands on the white linen tablecloth. I stared directly into Vivian's panicked eyes. When I refused to stand, Vivian let out a long, dramatic sigh, adjusting her grip on the microphone. As you can see, Jada has always struggled with basic social decorum. It is a tragedy, really. While Chloe was dedicating her life to her education and preparing to stand beside a man of Preston's caliber, Jada chose a different path. She chose to turn her back on this family. She dropped out of college, refusing to apply herself. She abandoned her grieving mother and her younger sister, packing her cheap bags and running away up north, because the standard of excellence in this household was simply too high for her to comprehend. A collective murmur of secondhand embarrassment swept through the Magnolia Room. Women in designer gowns shifted uncomfortably in their seats, leaning in to whisper to their husbands. Preston's wealthy relatives exchanged deeply critical glances, completely appalled that Vivian would air this level of toxic family laundry during a formal rehearsal dinner. But Vivian was entirely blind to their judgment. She was running on pure adrenaline and sheer panic. She thought humiliating me would strip me of my power. She thought breaking me down in front of billionaires would render my unseen threats useless. "We have not heard from Jada in years," Vivian projected, her voice rising in pitch. But suddenly, when she caught wind of this spectacular wedding, when she realized her sister was marrying into the Vanguard legacy, she miraculously found her way back to Atlanta. It breaks a mother's heart to see her own flesh and blood struggling so deeply. To see her reduced to crawling back just to secure a free hot meal among people she abandoned. But we are a family of grace. We are a family of Christian charity. And tonight we welcome her back into the fold despite her massive failures. She looked at me expecting to see tears. She expected me to look down at my plate in absolute shame. She expected the terrified, insecure teenager she had kicked out of her house all those years ago. Instead, I casually picked up my heavy silver steak knife. I sliced a perfectly square piece of medium-rare filet mignon, placed it in my mouth, and chewed slowly. I maintained unbroken, unblinking eye contact with her the entire time. The absolute ice in my veins radiated across the room. I was entirely unfazed. Her words were empty liabilities on a fraudulent balance sheet, and I was the relentless auditor holding the red pen. Vivian's confident smile faltered. Her chest heaved as she realized her public execution had completely failed to draw blood. The silence in the room was deafening. The wealthy guests were holding their breath, waiting for me to scream or run out of the room crying. When I did, neither the heavy, suffocating tension bounced right back onto Vivian. She was standing in the center of the room, holding a microphone, looking like an unhinged, desperate woman attacking a guest who was completely ignoring her. She needed to force my hand. She needed to prove to Preston and his powerful father that the land development rights were entirely secure. She raised her hand and snapped her fingers sharply at the head waiter standing near the kitchen doors. "Of course, grace requires participation," Vivian announced, her voice trembling slightly as she tried to regain control of the room. "We cannot simply welcome someone back into the inner circle without a small demonstration of family loyalty. Jada, since you have decided to join us tonight, it is time to clear up some old, unfinished family business. Just a minor clerical error regarding your late father's abandoned property." The head waiter, wearing crisp white gloves, walked briskly past the sprawling tables of the Atlanta elite. He approached table 14 and stopped directly next to my chair. He carried a heavy, dark leather legal portfolio. With practiced precision, he unzipped the portfolio and laid it open right next to my crystal water glass. Sitting inside was the fraudulent quitclaim deed, transferring my commercial property directly to Vanguard Properties. Next to it was a solid gold Mont Blanc pen. "Sign the waiver," Jada, Vivian commanded through the microphone, her voice echoing harshly off the vaulted ceilings. "Sign it right now in front of this entire room to prove you are actually committed to this family. Sign it, and you can stay to enjoy the rest of the meal we so generously provided for you. Refuse, and you can walk yourself right out the back door and back to whatever miserable life you came from." The entire Magnolia room was paralyzed in a state of absolute suffocating silence. Vivian stood in the center of the floor, clutching the wireless microphone with white-knuckled desperation, while the echo of her vicious public ultimatum faded into the high vaulted ceilings. The wealthy guests seated at the surrounding tables had entirely stopped eating. Forks hovered mid-air over expensive cuts of meat. No one dared to speak. They simply stared at me, sitting completely unbothered at table 14, staring back at the woman who had just demanded I sign away my father's legacy for the price of a dinner plate. Preston immediately realized that Vivian's hysterical approach was failing. He saw my total lack of intimidation and quickly recognized that attempting to publicly bully an estranged family member into signing a legal document in front of 80 corporate investors was a massive strategic liability. He handed his crystal champagne flute to a passing waiter and swiftly stepped down from the mahogany platform, leaving Chloe standing awkwardly by herself under the spotlight. He strode purposefully across the dining room, projecting the manufactured ease of a seasoned executive stepping in to de-escalate a minor bureaucratic misunderstanding. He reached table 14 and placed both of his hands firmly on the white linen tablecloth, leaning in close to invade my personal space. The scent of his overpowering designer cologne clashed horribly with the lingering smell of cold panic radiating from his pores. He offered me a patronizing, deeply privileged smile. "Jada, let us all just take a collective breath here," Preston said, his voice dropping to a smooth, condescending hum designed to sound entirely reasonable. He reached out with his right hand, the counterfeit luxury watch flashing under the chandeliers, and casually slid the heavy leather portfolio directly in front of my chest. "There is absolutely no need for any of this theatrical hostility tonight." Preston continued tapping the leather cover with his index finger. "We are here to celebrate. We are here to merge our families. Your mother is simply a bit highly strung right now because she wants this wedding weekend to go perfectly. Let me explain this to you in simple terms so we can all move past it and enjoy our meals. This document sitting right here is just a routine standard quitclaim deed. It is purely administrative paperwork." I did not respond. I simply kept my eyes locked on his face, watching the microscopic beads of sweat forming along his hairline. "You see, your late father, Calvin, was a good man, but he was notoriously disorganized with his personal finances." Preston explained, his tone dripping with fake sympathy. "He left behind a tiny, completely worthless fraction of ownership in a defunct property line out on the west side. It is a useless strip of dirt that has been sitting abandoned for decades. It has absolutely zero market value. But because my firm is stepping in to develop the surrounding area to build this massive, incredible tech hub, I just announced my zoning lawyers require a clean title to proceed." Preston leaned in a fraction closer, lowering his voice as if he were letting me in on a corporate secret. "We are breaking ground tomorrow morning, Jada. The bulldozers are already fueled up and parked on the perimeter. The city inspectors are scheduled to arrive at dawn. I just need your quick signature to clear up this minor historical clerical error. It is a tiny legal technicality that means absolutely nothing to you, but it will save my legal team a massive administrative headache. Sign the paperwork and I will personally ensure you are treated like a VIP for the rest of this weekend." I looked down at the portfolio and then looked back up at Preston. He was lying through his teeth with the practiced ease of a man who had spent his entire life failing upwards. He thought I was an uneducated data entry clerk who would see a legal document and blindly obey the commanding voice of a wealthy man in a velvet jacket. He had absolutely no idea that I could dismantle his entire shell corporation blindfolded. Before I could formulate my response, Vivian marched over to the table. She could not handle relinquishing control of the narrative. She stepped up right behind Preston, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. The microphone was gripped in one hand, while she used the other to point an accusing manicured finger directly at my face. "Preston is being far too generous with you," Vivian hissed, her voice sharp and brittle. She made sure she spoke loudly enough for the adjacent tables of elite socialites to hear every single word of her maternal benevolence. "I am giving you an opportunity, Jada. This is your one single chance to prove that you are not a complete and utter failure." I leaned back slowly in my velvet chair, crossing my legs and giving her my full, undivided attention. You ran away from your obligations 5 years ago, Vivian declared, her voice shaking with self-righteous fury. You dropped out of school. You abandoned your sister. You abandoned your grieving mother. You walked out on this family, and you have contributed absolutely nothing to our legacy since the day you left. But tonight, I am willing to offer you grace. She slammed her hand flat onto the table right next to my plate, causing my water glass to rattle. Here is the ultimatum! Jada Vivian demanded, her eyes wide with manic desperation. You pick up a pen and you sign that quitclaim deed right now. You give Preston the clearance he needs for his spectacular project. If you do that, I will publicly forgive your past transgressions. I will allow you to stay and eat with my guests tonight. I will even permit you to attend the actual wedding ceremony tomorrow afternoon and stand in the back row to support your beautiful sister. You will finally be allowed to be a part of this family again. Vivian leaned closer, her breath hot and shallow. But if you refuse me, she whispered venomously, if you try to cause a scene or hold up my future son-in-law's multi-million-dollar development, I will signal the club security right now. They will physically drag you out of this dining room and throw you onto the street. You will never see Chloe again. You will never step foot in Atlanta again. Now pick up the pen and do exactly what you are told. The silence in the Magnolia Room was absolute. Preston stood tall, flashing a victorious, smug smile, certain that the sheer weight of Vivian's brutal social pressure had crushed any remaining resistance I might have harbored. Chloe was watching from the podium, looking incredibly pleased that her charity case sister was finally being put in her proper place. They all thought the trap had closed. They all thought they had won. I did not break eye contact with Vivian. I slowly uncrossed my legs and leaned forward in my chair. I reached out with a steady, perfectly calm hand and grabbed the edge of the leather portfolio. I flipped the cover open, exposing the crisp legal documents resting inside. I ignored Vivian completely and focused entirely on the paperwork. I took my time. I let them sweat in the agonizing silence. I scanned the dense legal jargon, reading the deliberately confusing clauses designed to obscure the true nature of the property transfer. I saw the specific parcel numbers listed in the fine print. They were the exact same parcel numbers printed on the original ironclad deeds currently sitting inside my locked briefcase. Preston was not asking for a tiny fraction of a defunct property line. He was legally attempting to steal the entire multi-million-dollar commercial district straight out of my irrevocable trust. I smoothly reached into the interior breast pocket of my custom-tailored suit jacket. I bypassed my phone and pulled out a solid silver fountain pen. The heavy metal caught the light of the chandeliers gleaming sharply in my hand. Preston's smug smile widened into a full-blown grin. He let out a quiet breath of relief, visibly relaxing his shoulders as he watched me uncap the pen. Vivian uncrossed her arms, a look of pure triumphant validation washing over her face. She truly believed she had broken me. She believed her psychological warfare had worked perfectly. I lowered the tip of the silver pen toward the signature line at the bottom of the fraudulent quitclaim deed. I hovered the ink a millimeter above the paper. And then I stopped. I slowly capped the pen and placed it gently on top of the document. I looked up, bypassing Vivian entirely, and locked my eyes directly onto Preston's face. The absolute predatory calm in my voice cut through the dead silence of the room like a scalpel. I have a quick question about this minor clerical error, Preston, I said, my voice carrying perfectly to the surrounding tables of high-powered investors. Did your financial backers know you are attempting to break ground tomorrow morning on a multi-million-dollar commercial development project using land that you do not legally own? Preston's face underwent a fascinating and rapid metamorphosis. The smug, arrogant tan he had likely acquired at a ridiculously overpriced country club drained away in an instant, leaving behind a sickly, translucent pallor. Then, as the weight of my words collided with his reality, a dark, blotchy red crept up from his collar, consuming his neck and flushing his cheeks. He opened his mouth, but his vocal cords completely failed him. He let out a pathetic, strangled sound that was half gasp and half stutter. He looked wildly around the room, his eyes darting from the fraudulent document on the table to my perfectly composed face, and then out toward the sea of wealthy investors who were suddenly hanging on my every word. "I am sorry, what did you just say?" Preston finally choked out, his voice cracking. He tried to force a laugh, but it sounded like a dry heave. "This is absurd, Jada. You do not even know what you are looking at. You are confusing my guests with your complete lack of business comprehension." I did not remain seated. I pushed my heavy velvet chair back, allowing the wooden legs to scrape loudly against the polished hardwood floor. The harsh, abrasive sound cut through the suffocating silence of the Magnolia Room like a starting gun. I stood up slowly, deliberately smoothing the front of my midnight blue suit. I planted my feet, firmly establishing my absolute physical command over the space. I was no longer the quiet observer sitting in the shadows near the kitchen doors. I was the executioner stepping onto the scaffold. I picked up the dark leather portfolio from the table, holding the fraudulent quitclaim deed up, so the ambient light of the chandeliers caught the crisp white paper. I did not look at Vivian, who was currently hyperventilating near the podium. I did not look at Chloe, whose jaw had dropped open in absolute uncomprehending shock. I bypassed Preston entirely. I turned my body and directed my gaze squarely toward the center of the room, specifically locking eyes with Preston's father, a notoriously ruthless real estate tycoon who was currently staring at his son with an expression of dawning horror. "Let me be perfectly clear so there is absolutely no confusion regarding the business comprehension happening in this room," I announced, projecting my voice so that it reverberated off the high vaulted ceilings. Preston just stood on that stage and assured every single banker, developer, and investor in this building that Vanguard Properties has secured the exclusive development rights to the West Side Riverfront District. He claimed he has the legal clearance to break ground tomorrow morning on a massive tech hub. I held the document higher, lightly tapping the signature line with my index finger. "But this document he just handed me tells an entirely different story," I continued, my voice ringing with absolute chilling authority. "This document is a quitclaim deed drafted by Vanguard Properties, attempting to silently transfer ownership of specific parcels of land. Let us read them for the public record, shall we? Parcel number 409-alpha. Parcel number 409-beta. Parcel number 410, encompassing the entirety of the abandoned industrial railway line." I read the numbers with surgical precision, articulating every single syllable. A low, dangerous murmur began to ripple through the crowd of elite guests. Men in expensive dinner jackets leaned forward, their eyes narrowing. These were not stupid people. They were predators who understood the exact value of land and the catastrophic implications of title fraud. They knew exactly which parcels I was naming. I was naming the exact geographic footprint of Preston's heavily publicized flagship project. These parcel numbers do not represent a tiny, worthless fraction of a defunct property line. I stated, walking slowly around the edge of table 14, bridging the gap between my corner and the wealthy elite. These specific parcels represent the absolute core foundation of the entire West Side development. They are the primary access roads, the riverfront acreage, and the central commercial zones. Without these exact parcels, the tech hub cannot exist. The bulldozers currently parked on the perimeter are sitting on land they have absolutely no legal right to touch. Preston lunged forward, slapping his hand down onto the table. "Stop talking!" he shouted, his voice shrill and panicked. "You are ruining the dinner. You are lying. You are a bitter, jealous college dropout who came here to ruin Chloe's wedding weekend. Security!" He looked frantically toward the heavy wooden doors. "Somebody get security in here right now and drag her out." No one moved. The private security guard standing near the exits remained perfectly still, looking toward Preston's father for direction. Preston's father did not move a muscle. He was staring at the quitclaim deed in my hand, his face a mask of absolute terrifying fury. I ignored Preston's pathetic outburst entirely. I reached down and picked up my slim leather briefcase from the floor. I placed it squarely in the center of the white linen tablecloth, right next to the remnants of my filet mignon. The metallic click of the brass locks echoing in the quiet room sounded like a vault sealing shut. I flipped the briefcase open. If Vanguard Properties actually possessed the exclusive development rights to this land, as Preston so confidently announced to his creditors just 10 minutes ago, I said, reaching into the briefcase, then he would not be standing here sweating through his off-the-rack velvet jacket, begging me to sign a fraudulent transfer deed in the middle of a rehearsal dinner. I pulled out a thick, heavy stack of documents. They were not printed on standard office paper. They were bound in thick legal backing stamped with the raised gold seals of the county clerk and the state zoning board. I raised the stack of documents high in the air and then brought them down onto the table with a massive, resonant thud. The sound made Vivian physically jump backward. These are the original certified ironclad land deeds to parcels 409 and 410, I announced, my voice echoing with devastating finality. Accompanying them are the fully approved, updated commercial zoning permits issued directly by the City of Atlanta just 3 weeks ago. They are entirely free and clear of any liens, encumbrances, or family trusts. Vivian secretly attempted to lease this land to Vanguard Properties using outdated, fraudulent paperwork that she had absolutely no legal authority to sign. She sold you a ghost, Preston, and you were arrogant enough to buy it without running a basic title check. The silence in the Magnolia Room shattered. The polite murmurs of the wealthy guests instantly transformed into a chaotic uproar of panicked conversations. Banking executives began pulling out their cell phones, frantically scrolling through their emails and dialing their compliance officers. The illusion of the Vanguard Empire was collapsing in real time, and I was orchestrating the demolition. Chloe finally broke her paralysis, stepping down from the platform and rushing over to Preston. "What is she talking about?" "Preston," she demanded, her voice shrill and whining. "Tell them she is lying. Tell them you own the land. This is my wedding weekend. You promised me this project was going to make us billionaires." Preston could not even look at her. He was staring at the certified deeds on the table, his breathing shallow and rapid. He looked like a man watching his own executioner sharpen the blade. "I am not quite finished," I said, cutting through the rising panic in the room. My voice demanded absolute compliance, and the room immediately quieted down again, desperate to hear the final verdict. "You see, I did not just stumble into this information. I continued, stepping away from the table and walking directly toward the center of the room, claiming the space Vivian had occupied just moments ago. While my mother and sister were busy mocking my choice of clothing and laughing about my supposed administrative job, I was actively consolidating my assets. I am not a data entry clerk up in Chicago. I am the sole managing director and primary shareholder of Apex Holdings. I watched the recognition hit the faces of the most powerful investors in the room. Apex Holdings had been aggressively, quietly buying up distressed commercial real estate across the eastern seaboard for the last 4 years. I had systematically built a pristine, untouchable portfolio, while Vivian spent her days shopping for fake diamonds and leveraging her social status to stay relevant. Apex Holdings owns the holding company that currently controls the entire West Side District, I stated, locking eyes with Preston's father once again. I am the sole owner of the very ground you are attempting to break tomorrow morning. And I can assure every single investor in this room that Vanguard Properties does not have a lease, a permit, or a single shred of legal authority to develop my land." Vivian let out a strangled sob, covering her face with her hands. Her entire world, her carefully curated facade of wealth and prestige, was burning to ashes around her. But I was not done. I had promised myself a total financial bloodbath, and I intended to deliver on that promise. I turned my attention back to Preston, who was leaning heavily against the table, looking like he was about to vomit. "When my legal team discovered this blatant attempt at property fraud, we did not just stop at the title check," I said, leaning in, slightly lowering my voice to a lethal, calm register. "We decided to run a comprehensive forensic audit on the entirety of Vanguard Properties. We wanted to see exactly why a supposedly prestigious development firm was resorting to backdoor quitclaim deeds and back-alley negotiations with a desperate woman like my mother." Preston shook his head violently, his eyes pleading with me to stop. "Please," he whispered the word barely audible over the hum of the air conditioning. "Jada, please do not do this." I did not blink. I did not show a single ounce of mercy. The forensic audit was incredibly illuminating, I announced, turning to face the crowd of elite bankers who were currently holding the debt that was keeping Vanguard Properties afloat. It turns out Vanguard is not building a legacy. Vanguard is currently suffocating under a mountain of toxic, over-leveraged corporate debt. You are facing imminent bankruptcy, Preston. You are drowning in defaulting loans and angry creditors. This entire tech hub project was a massive, glittering lie. It was a completely desperate attempt to secure fresh bridging loans using stolen collateral just to keep your lights on for another quarter. The room erupted. It was no longer a polite gathering of high society. It was a panicked feeding frenzy of wealthy investors, realizing they had just been conned out of millions. Preston's father slammed his fist down onto his table, his face dark with absolute rage, directing his fury entirely at his son. Chloe began to scream hysterically, slapping Preston's chest, demanding answers he could not give. Vivian stood completely frozen by the kitchen doors, entirely destroyed by the reality that she had just sold her golden child to a bankrupt fraud. I stood in the center of the chaos, perfectly calm. I reached out, picked up my crystal flute of champagne from the table, and took a slow, deliberate sip. The vintage wine tasted like absolute victory. The steel jaws of the trap had snapped shut, and the legacy of Vanguard Properties was officially dead. The air in the Magnolia Room became frigid, stripped of its warmth by the collective intake of breath from 80 of Atlanta's wealthiest and most influential citizens. Preston froze his hands, still gripping the table, his knuckles white as bone. He looked like he had been struck by a physical blow. The silence was not just an absence of noise, it was a heavy, suffocating pressure that filled every corner of the room. "Lies!" Vivian screeched. Her voice shattered the quiet, a jagged, shrill sound that made the guests wince. She had lost all pretense of elegance. Her makeup, applied by the finest professionals in the city, looked stark and manic against her skin. "These are not deeds. You have clearly forged these ridiculous papers just to cause a scene, because you are bitter, you are jealous because your sister is getting everything you never could." She lunged toward me, her heels clattering like gunfire against the hardwood, but she stopped short when she saw the look on my face. I did not move, I did not flinch. I watched her with a pity that clearly terrified her more than any threat could have. "Calvin died with nothing but debt," Vivian shouted, her gaze darting to the investors at the head table. She was playing to the audience now, desperate to claw back her social capital. "He was a fool who wasted his life chasing imaginary investments. He didn't own a single square inch of the West Side District. He lost it all years ago, and he left us with nothing but legal bills and heartache. This is a pathetic, desperate stunt from a failed daughter trying to ruin her sister's wedding weekend." Preston, finding his voice, scrambled to join her. "She is right," he stammered, his eyes darting wildly. "Jada is unstable. She has always been a compulsive liar. Security, for the love of God, remove her. She is trespassing and disrupting a private event." I waited. I let him yell. I let him expose his own desperation to every single person in that room. I looked over at Preston's father, the titan of industry, who had built Vanguard Properties into a household name. He was not looking at me with the same contempt as his son. He was looking at the documents on the table with a cold, calculated interest. He was a professional. He knew a genuine legal crisis when he saw one, and he knew when his son had been played. "I am not trespassing, Preston," I said, my voice cutting through his panic. I gestured toward the room full of people. "I am a guest. You invited me, remember? You welcomed me back into the fold to humiliate me. Well, I have accepted the invitation." Vivian spun toward the event coordinator, her face twisted. "Get her out of here now, or I will have this club shut down." "You can try, Vivian," I said, my voice cool and even, "but I think your guests are far more interested in why you are so terrified of these documents." I picked up the folder labeled in the records as Duyen Mao 1_17.docx and held it aloft. This forensic analysis contains the complete financial breakdown of Vanguard Properties. It details the precise moment the firm became insolvent. It shows exactly how you have been using fraudulent shell companies to siphon off capital from investor accounts, funneling it into private trust funds that do not exist on any public ledger. A gasp rippled through the room. The men in expensive suits stood up, their chairs pushed back, creating a chorus of scraping wood on the floor. "She is lying," Vivian cried, her voice cracking. "Preston, tell them she is a fraud." Preston was now a statue of shock. He was staring at the documents with the terrified realization that his entire life of privilege was evaporating. He started, his voice barely a whisper. "The deeds. I had the team verify." "You had the team verify the forgeries you paid for," I said, stepping closer to him. "You didn't verify the title. You didn't check the county clerk's updated registry. You just assumed that because my father was dead and I was poor, you could simply sweep this land under the rug. You didn't even bother to check who was paying the property taxes for the last 5 years. Because it was me. Every single cent." I turned to the room. "These documents, specifically those found in Duyen Mao 2_17.docx, are the official property tax records and the verified deed transfers. I am the majority shareholder of the holding company that owns the West Side District. I have been for 3 years." Vivian looked as if she might collapse. She reached out to steady herself against a chair, her hand trembling. "It doesn't matter," she hissed, trying one last time to regain her composure. "You are nobody. You are a disgrace to this family. Even if you owned the land, it would be a tragedy to let it fall into your hands. You would destroy it. You would sell it to the highest bidder." "That is exactly what you did, isn't it?" I asked, my voice rising in volume, echoing through the expansive room. "You and Richard, and then you and Preston. You didn't build, you stripped. You took land meant for development and turned it into a scheme for liquidity. You used this wedding as a front for a massive real estate heist, hoping that once the vows were exchanged and the assets merged, the crime would be buried under the celebration." Preston's father finally stood up. He walked slowly toward the table, his movements heavy and deliberate. He was a man who had seen everything, a man who had survived market crashes and political scandals. He looked at the documents on the table, then at his son, and then at me. "Preston," he said, his voice terrifyingly quiet. "Is it true?" Preston didn't answer. He couldn't. His breath came in shallow, ragged gasps. "He doesn't know how to answer that, sir," I said, meeting the older man's gaze. "Because the answer is yes. And if you would like the full disclosure of his firm's current liabilities, you need only look at the summary in Duyen Mao 3_17.docx. It is all there. The shell accounts, the hidden debts, the pending lawsuits. He isn't building a tech hub. He is building a fortress of cards, and he was hoping my land would provide the foundation to hold it up for a few more months." "This is madness," Vivian cried, though her voice lacked conviction. She was looking around the room, realizing that the people she had cultivated for years, the ones who provided her with access and influence, were no longer looking at her with admiration. They were looking at her with cold, clinical detachment, the kind of look investors give a stock that has just hit zero. "You are finished, Vivian," I said, turning to look at her. "You are not the Queen of Atlanta. You are a woman who orchestrated a fraudulent land grab and got caught. And you, Preston, you are not a visionary developer. You are a bankrupt con man who thought he could steal from the wrong sister." I reached into my briefcase once more and pulled out a small yellowed envelope. It was slightly frayed at the edges, the kind of paper that had aged over time. I held it in my hand, feeling its weight. This was the final piece of the puzzle. This was the one thing that would burn the last of their defenses to the ground. "You both are so obsessed with the law," I said softly. "You think if you have the right signatures and the right lawyers, you can own anything you want. You think you can steal the life my father worked for and call it business." I looked at the folder labeled Duyen Mao 4_17.docx and the paper inside. "Calvin did leave a will, Vivian. I know you burned the copy you kept in your safe. I know you convinced the executors he was broke so they wouldn't bother with the probate. But he was smarter than you gave him credit for. He didn't just leave a will, he left a letter." The room was so quiet I could hear the hum of the air conditioning unit. Vivian's eyes widened. She knew. She remembered the letter. I saw the recognition, the sheer cold terror that flooded her features. She remembered the day Calvin had left it, the day he had warned her about her greed, the day he had anticipated exactly this moment. "A letter," Preston whispered, his voice trembling. "What letter?" "A letter he wrote specifically because he knew exactly what you were stealing," I said, my gaze shifting back to Vivian. "He knew you would come for this land. He knew you would wait until he was gone, and he knew you would try to use his own daughters to get it. He didn't trust you with the legal process, so he trusted me with the truth." I took the letter out of the envelope. It was handwritten, the ink slightly faded, but the script bold and unmistakable. I didn't need to read it aloud yet. The mere existence of it was enough. The sight of it in my hand was a confession of her long-term plan, a roadmap of her betrayals that she had spent decades trying to erase. "This letter details every single one of your financial manipulations over the last 20 years. I continued, holding the paper up. "It details the money you siphoned from the family accounts, the properties you undervalued so you could buy them back through your shell corporations. And yes, Vivian, it details the secret meeting you had with Preston's father 3 years ago to discuss exactly how to separate me from my legal inheritance." Vivian let out a strangled cry and lunged for the letter. But Preston, his survival instinct finally kicking in, grabbed her arm and pulled her back. He had realized that attacking me further would only solidify his guilt. "Jada," he said, his voice raw, pleading. "Let's be reasonable. We can negotiate. We can share the proceeds of the development. Just, please, don't read the letter." "Negotiate?" I let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. "You want to negotiate for your life, Preston. You wanted me to sign away my rights for a seat in the back row of your wedding. You wanted to treat me like a disposable commodity. And now you want to negotiate?" I looked around the room. The guests were leaning in their faces, hungry for the scandal, their loyalty to Vanguard Properties completely severed by the cold reality of my evidence. They weren't looking at Preston as a potential business partner anymore. They were looking at him as a liability. "There is no negotiation," I said, my voice echoing with a finality that made the security guards finally take a step toward us. "The property is mine, the company is bankrupt, and the truth is about to be the only thing that matters." I opened the letter and looked at the first paragraph. I did not read it, but I let the silence stretch, watching the way Vivian's face disintegrated. The woman who had spent her entire life projecting perfection, who had spent decades crafting a narrative of influence and grace, was now reduced to a shivering, panic-stricken wreck. She knew that when I finished reading, there would be no going back. She knew that her life, as she had created it, was ending in this dining room surrounded by the very people she had spent years trying to impress. "Calvin wrote this," I began, my voice steady, "because he loved his family, but he understood the nature of greed. He wrote, 'To my dearest daughter Jada, if you are reading this, it means the people I thought would protect you have chosen to prey upon you instead. I have laid out the following evidence.'" "Stop!" Vivian screamed, but her voice was drowned out by the sound of the event coordinator signaling the security team. "She is the one who is trespassing!" Vivian shrieked, pointing at me, but her hand was shaking violently. "She is the one who has forged these papers. Do not let her destroy this night." "The night is already destroyed, Vivian," I said, folding the letter. "The only question now is how much you are going to lose." I looked at Preston's father. He stood tall, his expression unreadable, his eyes fixed on the letter in my hand. He was calculating the cost of this scandal, weighing the damage to his own company's reputation against the potential for cutting his losses. He looked at Preston, who was now weeping openly, and then at Vivian, who was still trying to shout down the reality of the situation. The silence that followed was heavy, laden with the weight of the lies they had built their lives upon. I held the letter, the paper cool in my hand, and waited for the next move. The game was over. The bluff had been called, and the truth, the absolute, undeniable truth, was the only thing left in the room. "Well," I said, my voice cutting through the noise, "who wants to talk about the land?" The reaction was immediate. A dozen investors stood up, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of demands. They wanted the truth. They wanted the documents. They wanted to know if their money was gone. Preston fell into his chair, covering his face with his hands, his collapse total and complete. Vivian, seeing her social standing dissolve into nothing, finally collapsed into a chair, her eyes glassy and unfocused. I stood in the center of the room, surrounded by the wreckage of their ambition. I held the keys to the future of the West Side District, and I held the truth of their past. I was no longer the daughter they had discarded, the person they had expected to manipulate. I was the person they had feared, the one who had seen through their lies, the one who had finally claimed what was rightfully hers. "The land is mine," I repeated, my voice calm. "And it will stay that way. Vanguard Properties will not be building anything here, because there is no Vanguard Properties anymore." The room seemed to spin as the guests began to realize the implications of my statement. It wasn't just a business deal that had failed. It was an entire empire that had been built on stolen ground and fraudulent records. I looked at the table of the elite, the men and women who had watched Vivian's toast with amusement and then horror. They were the ones who had enabled this, the ones who had looked the other way, while they leveraged my father's legacy for their own profit. "Every one of you," I said, addressing the room, "who signed a contract with Preston, who invested in this lie, needs to start looking for your exit strategy, because I am not just holding the deeds, I am holding the proof of fraud. And tomorrow this proof will be in the hands of the Attorney General." A collective gasp swept through the room. This was no longer just a private family matter. It was a matter of state and federal law. "You wouldn't," Vivian whispered, her voice a shadow of its former sharp self. "You would destroy us all." "You destroyed yourselves, Vivian," I said, turning my back on her and facing the rest of the room. "I just turned on the lights." I signaled to my legal team, who had been waiting quietly near the entrance. They moved forward, unzipping their own portfolios and distributing copies of the forensic audit and the land title verification. The chaos that ensued was magnificent. Investors clamoring for documents, Preston's father demanding answers, Vivian's guests scrambling to distance themselves from the unfolding scandal. I didn't stay to watch the fallout. I walked toward the back of the room, past the stunned event staff, toward the heavy wooden doors that led out to the cool evening air. I had done what I had come to do. I had taken back what was mine. I had exposed the truth, and I had ensured that the legacy my father had built would not be stolen to feed the greed of people who had never respected it. As I reached the door, I looked back one last time at the Magnolia Room. The scene was pure, unadulterated devastation. Preston was still sitting in his chair. His father was arguing with the head of the security team, and Vivian was sitting in the corner, a broken woman watching her world disappear. I felt a profound sense of closure. The long shadow of their influence had finally been lifted, and for the first time I could see my own future clearly. I stepped out into the night, the cool breeze hitting my face, the sound of the city lights and life ahead. I had won not just the land, but the freedom to be myself. And the best part, I had done it all without playing by their rules. I had used their own greed, their own pride, and their own lies against them. The game was over. The era of Vanguard Properties was dead. And I was just getting started. I walked toward the valet stand, my steps steady and sure, ready to begin the next chapter of my life on my own terms. The city lights beckoned, promising new beginnings and endless possibilities, and I was ready for every single one of them. The long, dark night of my family's betrayal had finally ended, and the morning was looking brighter than I could have ever imagined. I smoothed the creases of the yellowed paper. The Magnolia Room was so quiet I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning vents overhead. 80 of Atlanta's most powerful people sat entirely paralyzed. Preston was slumped in his chair, looking physically ill. His father stood rigid, his eyes burning a hole through Vivian. Chloe was clutching the edge of the head table, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. But Vivian simply stared at the letter in my hands. The blood had completely drained from her face. I cleared my throat. My voice resonated across the dining room, clear and unwavering. To my dearest daughter Jada, the letter began. If you are reading this, it means the people I thought would protect you have chosen to prey upon you instead. I have laid out the following evidence: Because I know the depths of your mother's greed, and I know she will not stop until she has consumed every last resource attached to our family name. Stop reading! Vivian shrieked. She lunged forward, her manicured hands grasping at the empty air. That is a forgery. He was heavily medicated at the end. He was delusional. He did not know what he was writing. You wrote that yourself, you vindictive little liar. Sit down, Vivian Preston's father barked. His voice sounded like cracking ice. The sheer authority in his tone made Vivian flinch. She stumbled backward, collapsing heavily into her velvet chair. I did not break my rhythm. I kept my eyes locked on the aged paper, letting my late father's truth dismantle her pristine high society facade piece by piece. For the last 4 years, I have watched Vivian quietly siphon money from our primary accounts. Calvin wrote his words echoing through my voice. I watched her manufacture fake business expenses to cover her extravagant lifestyle. I tracked the offshore transfers. I saw the receipts for the luxury cars, the designer wardrobes, and the countless weekend getaways. But more importantly, I documented the affairs. I know about the men she entertained while I was undergoing chemotherapy. I know she bled my life's work dry to fund her vanity and her betrayals. A collective gasp ripped through the room. Several of the wealthy socialites who regularly attended Vivian's exclusive charity galas covered their mouths in absolute shock. The banking executives exchanged dark, knowing glances. Vivian's carefully curated image as the devoted, grieving widow was evaporating into thin air. She was exposed as an embezzler and an adulterer in front of the very people whose approval she valued above oxygen. She thought I was blind. Calvin's letter continued. She thought I was too weak to notice the discrepancies. She assumed that when I died, she would simply inherit the remainder of the estate and cast you aside. She always favored Chloe because Chloe is a mirror of her own superficial ambition. But I refused to let her leave you with nothing. I could not save the liquid assets she had already stolen, but I could protect the foundation of our future. I paused, looking up from the page. Vivian was shaking violently. Her hands gripped the tablecloth so tightly, her knuckles were translucent. Her breathing was ragged. She looked like a trapped animal, realizing the cage had been locked for years. I took the most valuable overlooked assets in our portfolio. Calvin's words rang out. I took the defunct industrial plots on the west side, the land Vivian laughed at and called worthless dirt, and I transferred them entirely out of the primary estate. I placed every single parcel into an impenetrable blind trust. I named you Jada as the sole and exclusive beneficiary. I knew that one day that land would be the key to the city's expansion. I knew it would make you a kingmaker. And I knew I had to engineer a legal fortress to keep your mother from ever touching a single acre of it. I slowly folded the letter, sliding it back into the yellowed envelope. I placed it securely inside my briefcase next to the certified deeds. The quiet in the room was absolute. The entire social hierarchy of Atlanta was holding its collective breath, waiting for the final blow. I looked directly at Vivian. Do you remember my 16th birthday, Vivian? I asked, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. Do you remember the week I spent in the intensive care unit at Emory University Hospital? Vivian's eyes widened in sheer terror. She knew exactly what I was talking about. She shook her head desperately, trying to back away from the memory. She opened her mouth to deny it, to spin another lie, but the sheer weight of the room's attention suffocated her words. I had a collapsed lung, I announced to the silent room, pacing slowly parallel to the head table. I was lying in a hospital bed, suffocating, attached to a ventilator. The doctors needed to perform an emergency operation, but I was a minor. They needed a legal guardian's consent to cut into my chest. The hospital administrators called you over 30 times in 24 hours. The nurses left frantic voicemails, but you did not answer the phone. Do you want to tell your wealthy guests where you were while your teenage daughter was struggling to breathe? Vivian looked at Preston's father, who was glaring at her with absolute disgust. She looked at Chloe, who had suddenly stepped away from her mother, entirely unwilling to share the collateral damage. Chloe's face was a mask of selfish panic, realizing her mother was now a massive social liability. You were at a luxury spa resort in Sedona, I said, delivering the final devastating truth. You were getting mud wraps and drinking champagne with your friends using the very money you stole from my sick father. And when the hospital finally reached you on the emergency line, you refused to fly back to Atlanta. You told the chief of surgery that I was just being dramatic to ruin your vacation. You told them to give me pain medicine and wait until you returned on Monday. The horror in the Magnolia Room was palpable. The elite guests who just 10 minutes ago had viewed Vivian as a pillar of Southern grace now looked at her like she was a monster. The silence was heavy and toxic. Wealthy women who had just been air-kissing Vivian's cheeks now physically leaned away from her. But Grandma Loretta did not wait. I continued, my voice sharp and precise, cutting through the tension. She drove 4 hours straight through the night. She marched into that hospital, and she did the only thing she could do to save my life. She filed for emergency medical custody. The state of Georgia temporarily stripped you of your parental rights so the surgeons could operate and keep me alive. Vivian was weeping now, her mascara running down her cheeks in dark, jagged streaks. She tried to reach out toward me, her hands shaking violently, but her arms fell limply to her sides. She was completely broken. You thought that was just a humiliating family argument, Vivian? I said, stepping away from table 14 and walking directly toward the center of the room, claiming the exact spot she had used to humiliate me earlier. You thought it was just a temporary inconvenience, a funny story you could spin to your friends about a dramatic teenager and an overbearing grandmother. You never bothered to read the fine print of my father's estate planning. Calvin knew you would eventually abandon me. He knew your vanity would always eclipse your maternal instincts. So he built a specific trigger into the blind trust. I stopped a few feet away from where she sat, shivering in her expensive dress. I looked down at her, stripped of all her artificial power. The legal conditions of Calvin's trust were absolute, I declared, projecting my voice so every banker and investor could hear the flawless legal trap my father had built. The documents clearly stated that if Vivian ever abandoned her parental duties to the point of losing legal custody, even temporarily, her rights to contest the trust or access its assets were permanently and irrevocably severed. She could never sue. She could never claim a marital portion. She was legally exiled from the estate forever. I smiled a cold, devastating smile. Your refusal to leave your spa weekend legally locked you out of the trust, Vivian. Your own vanity was the exact trigger that activated my total control of the assets. You chose a mud wrap over your dying child, and that choice permanently locked you out of a multi-million-dollar real estate empire. You handed me the West Side District the moment you refused to get on that plane. The room was already fracturing into sheer chaos, but Chloe refused to let her fairy tale disintegrate. She stared at the yellowed letter in my hand, and then at the certified deeds resting on the table. The reality of her sudden poverty was simply incompatible with her carefully constructed worldview. She took a staggering step forward, the heavy silk of her custom engagement dress rustling loudly in the tense electric air. She turned her panicked gaze toward Preston, who was currently staring at his father with the expression of a condemned man waiting for the gallows to open. Chloe reached out and clamped her manicured hands around Preston's forearm, digging her acrylic nails into the expensive velvet of his jacket. "Preston, you have to fix this!" Chloe shrieked, her voice entirely stripped of its usual melodic, honeyed tone. Her eyes were wide with a frantic, desperate energy that bordered on genuine madness. "Do not just stand there letting her talk to us like this. Tell your lawyers to tear those fake documents apart. Make her sign the paperwork, Preston. You promised me this weekend was going to be perfect. You promised me we were going to be billionaires. Just make her sign the damn deed so we can go back to the celebration." Preston did not immediately respond. He stood perfectly rigid, staring down at the woman he was supposed to marry in less than 24 hours. The calculating machinery in his brain was working at absolute maximum capacity. He was a man accustomed to weighing assets against liabilities, and in that precise moment, the ultimate liability was clinging to his arm. He looked at Chloe's tear-streaked face and saw absolutely nothing of value. She brought no land to the merger. She brought no trust fund. She brought no silent capital. She possessed no leverage that could save his collapsing real estate empire from imminent bankruptcy. She was entirely worthless to him. The shift in his demeanor was terrifyingly instantaneous. The charming, affectionate facade he had worn all evening vanished completely, leaving behind a mask of pure, unadulterated contempt. He looked at Chloe, not as a bride, but as a bad investment that had just bankrupted him. Preston violently wrenched his arm backward, breaking Chloe's grip with such sudden force that she stumbled and nearly fell onto the polished hardwood floor. "Get your hands off me!" Preston snarled, his voice echoing across the Magnolia Room with shocking brutality. Chloe gasped, catching her balance against the edge of the head table. She looked at him as if he had just transformed into a monster right before her eyes. "Preston, what are you doing?" she sobbed, reaching for him again, her fingers trembling. "We are getting married tomorrow. My dress is upstairs. The guests are all here." "There is no wedding," Preston roared, turning to face his father and the rest of the room. "The wedding is officially canceled." A collective gasp rippled through the remaining guests. Vivian, who had been sitting frozen in her chair, suddenly jolted upright, as if struck by high-voltage lightning. "Preston, you cannot do this!" Vivian cried out, scrambling toward them, her voice cracking with terror. "The invitations have been sent. The press is scheduled. The society pages are covering the reception. You cannot back out now." Preston turned his wrath entirely upon my mother, pointing a shaking, accusatory finger directly at her face. "You listen to me, you pathetic, washed-up fraud," he shouted, spittle flying from his lips. "You lied to me. You both lied to me. You paraded around the country club acting like you owned the entire west side of the city. You led me to believe that marrying your vacuous daughter came with the commercial land rights my firm desperately needed to survive. You trapped me. You orchestrated this entire relationship to secure a bailout for your own empty bank accounts." He paced back and forth, his panic transforming into vicious outward aggression. "You misled Vanguard Properties. You promised collateral that you absolutely knew did not belong to you. You are nothing but common gold diggers dressed in borrowed couture. I spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on rings and vacations and private jets because I thought I was courting a real estate heiress. You set me up to take the fall for your own financial ruin. I will see to it that my legal team sues you for every single cent of the wedding expenses and seeks maximum damages for fraudulent misrepresentation." Preston's father had heard enough. The patriarch of the Vanguard Empire stepped forward, his face carved from solid granite. He looked at Vivian with a level of disgust usually reserved for vermin. "We are leaving," he announced, his voice a low, booming command that required absolute obedience. "Do not speak to my son. Do not contact my firm. If either of you ever approach my family again, I will personally ensure you are tied up in litigation until the day you die." He turned on his heel and marched toward the heavy wooden doors. The command sent an immediate shockwave through the room. The executives, the bankers, the developers, every single person associated with Vanguard Properties or the elite social circle immediately stood up. They gathered their coats and their expensive bags, eager to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the toxic wreckage of Vivian's family. They whispered furiously among themselves, casting judgmental glares at my mother as they hurried past table 14. "No, please wait!" Chloe screamed, running after Preston's father, her silk dress tangling around her legs. "Please, you cannot leave. The ceremony is tomorrow. Preston, please do not do this to me." Preston did not even look back. He adjusted his jacket, shot one final venomous glare at my mother, and followed his father out the door without a second thought. The mass exodus was swift and merciless. Within 90 seconds, the Magnolia Room was emptied of its wealth, its power, and its prestige. The only people remaining were the stunned waitstaff hovering nervously near the kitchen doors, Chloe sobbing uncontrollably near the exit, and Vivian. Vivian stood completely alone in the center of the abandoned dining room. The silence that followed the stampede was deafening. The grand floral arrangements, the crystal centerpieces, the counterfeit luxury, everything she had built her life upon, was now just a mocking reminder of her absolute failure. Her legs simply gave out. Vivian collapsed, dropping straight to her knees onto the hard floor. The elegant structure of her designer gown crumpled around her. The haughty, aristocratic posture she had maintained for decades vanished entirely. She looked small-aged and utterly broken. She did not look at the empty chairs or at Chloe crying by the doors. She crawled forward, dragging her silk dress across the polished wood, closing the distance between us until she was directly at my feet. She reached out and grabbed the hem of my trousers, her hands shaking with a violent, uncontrollable tremor. "Jada, please," Vivian begged, her voice a ragged, hysterical wheeze. "Please, you have to sign the papers. You have to give me the land." I looked down at her, feeling absolutely no pity. I stepped back, forcing her to release my suit. "I am not signing anything, Vivian. You have nothing left to threaten me with. The game is over." "You do not understand," she shrieked, tears and ruined makeup streaming down her face. She clasped her hands together in front of her chest, praying to the daughter she had thrown away. "I am out of time. I do not have a single cent to my name. I took out loans, Jada. Massive shadow loans from private lenders. I went to people who do not operate within the banking system. High-interest bridge loans, just to pay for the country club memberships, the cars, the clothes, this entire spectacular wedding." She gasped for air, her confession pouring out in a panicked, frantic torrent. "I promised the lenders that Chloe was marrying into the Vanguard Empire. I used the expected marriage settlement as collateral. I told them Preston would clear my debts once the families merged and the land was transferred. They are expecting their money on Monday morning, Jada. If the wedding is canceled, if Preston walks away, they will come to collect. I am millions in debt. They will take the house. They will take everything I have left. I will go to prison or worse. You have to save me." I looked down at the woman kneeling on the polished hardwood floor. Vivian was clutching the fabric of my trousers like a drowning sailor, grasping at a piece of shattered driftwood. The harsh ambient light from the crystal chandeliers illuminated the stark reality of her panic. Her flawless makeup was completely ruined, dark streaks of expensive mascara cutting through her pale foundation. The heavy silk of her designer gown pooled around her knees like a deflated parachute. She was gasping for air, her chest heaving as the sheer magnitude of her financial ruin threatened to crush her physical body. I did not reach out. I did not offer her a hand. I did not bend down to comfort her. I stood perfectly straight, my posture rigid, looking at her with a profound, icy detachment. There was a time many years ago when seeing my mother cry would have shattered my heart. I would have done anything to earn her approval, to dry her tears, to prove my worth to her. But that girl had died a long time ago, suffocated under the weight of Vivian's relentless cruelty and bottomless greed. "You want me to save you?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet it carried with crystal clarity through the empty, cavernous dining room. "You are kneeling on the floor of a country club you can no longer afford, begging the daughter you threw away to pay off the shadow loans you took out to impress a room full of people who just abandoned you." I took a deliberate step backward, forcing Vivian's hands to slip from my clothing. She fell forward slightly, her palms slapping against the cold wood. "I am not signing over a single square inch of the West Side District," I stated, my tone absolute and unyielding. "I am not authorizing a wire transfer. I am not bailing you out of a disaster entirely of your own making." "Please, Jada," Vivian choked out, her voice a pathetic, ragged whine. "They will take everything. I have nothing left. You do not understand what these lenders will do. They are not banks. They are dangerous people." "I understand perfectly," I replied, my voice devoid of a single ounce of empathy. "I understand exactly what it feels like to be completely out of options. I understand what it feels like to be desperate, gasping for air, praying that the one person who is supposed to protect you will finally answer the phone." Vivian flinched as if I had struck her across the face. She knew exactly where I was taking this. She shook her head desperately, trying to back away from the memory she had spent nearly 2 decades trying to bury. 17 years ago, Vivian, I was lying in a hospital bed at Emory University with a collapsed lung, I announced, pacing slowly around her kneeling form. "I was a child. I was terrified. I was drowning in my own body, waiting for my mother to grant the surgical consent that would save my life. But you were busy. You had a massage scheduled. You had champagne to drink with your socialite friends in Sedona. You looked at the choice between your daughter's survival and your own luxury vacation, and you chose the mud wrap. Vivian let out a low, agonizing moan, pressing her hands against her ears as if she could physically block out the truth. You made your choice 17 years ago. I continued staring down at her trembling shoulders. You decided my life was an inconvenience. You legally forfeited your right to this family, your right to my father's legacy, and your right to ever ask me for a single favor. You traded a multi-million-dollar commercial real estate empire for a spa weekend. I am simply enforcing the terms of the transaction you agreed to. Vivian looked up at me, her face a mask of pure devastation. I was foolish, she gasped, struggling to catch her breath. I was wrong. I was so arrogant. You are still arrogant, I corrected her sharply, halting my pacing to stand directly in front of her. Even tonight you could not help yourself. You stood in the center of this room and called me a family disappointment. You called me a data entry clerk. You called me a charity case. You tried to publicly bully me into submission because you truly believed I was too stupid and too broken to fight back. I gestured toward the empty tables, the half-eaten plates of expensive food abandoned by her fleeing guests. You were so entirely convinced of your own superiority that you never once bothered to ask how I survived after you cut me off. I said, my voice ringing with cold satisfaction. You never bothered to ask how I paid my rent, how I built my life, or how I learned to navigate the corporate world. You just assumed I was a failure because I did not conform to your shallow, glittering standard of success. Your absolute certainty that I was a worthless charity case was the exact blindfold I needed. You gave me the perfect cover to build Apex Holdings right under your nose. Your arrogance financed my stealth. I turned my gaze away from the pathetic woman on the floor and looked over at the heavy wooden doors. Chloe was still standing there. She had stopped sobbing and was now watching us with wide, terrified eyes. The reality of the situation had finally pierced through her self-centered delusion. She realized that the billionaire lifestyle she had been promised was dead, and she was now permanently anchored to a mother who owed millions to violent private lenders. But you do not need my help, Vivian, I said, projecting my voice across the room toward my sister. You have your golden child right there. You have the perfect daughter you always wanted. I pointed directly at Chloe. She immediately took a step backward, shrinking against the heavy mahogany doorframe. Ask Chloe to save you. I demanded, a harsh, mocking smile playing on my lips. She is the one with the impeccable social skills. She is the one who knows how to host a charity gala, how to pick out the perfect silk engagement dress, how to smile flawlessly for the society photographers. Go ahead, Vivian. Ask Chloe to march down to the Shadowlenders on Monday morning. Have her flash that perfect expensive smile and use her elite country club etiquette to negotiate the interest rates on your massive toxic debt. Chloe's face turned ash white. She shook her head violently, her hands gripping the doorframe so tightly her knuckles turned white. No, Chloe whispered, her voice trembling with sheer panic. I do not have any money. I do not know anything about loans or lenders. Mom, you told me Preston was paying for everything. You told me we were rich. You told me this wedding was going to fix everything. She lied to you, Chloe, I stated, my voice cutting through the heavy air with brutal clarity. She lied to Preston. She lied to the banks. And now the bill has come due. You wanted to be the center of attention. You wanted the grand legacy and the billionaire husband. Well, congratulations. The legacy is millions of dollars of high-interest debt and a mob of angry creditors. Use your impeccable golden child skills to fix it, because I am not lifting a single finger to stop the bleeding. Vivian let out a gut-wrenching wail and collapsed fully onto the floor. Her forehead rested against the cold wood as she sobbed into her arms. She was completely, utterly defeated. There was no scheme left to run, no lie left to spin. She was going to lose the house, the cars, the memberships, and whatever dignity she had left. I turned my back on her. I had extracted every ounce of justice I required from my mother and sister. The financial bloodbath was complete, and the toxic burden of seeking their approval was permanently lifted from my shoulders. I reached down, snapped my briefcase shut, and adjusted my custom-tailored jacket. I prepared to walk out of the Magnolia Room and leave them to their ruin. But as I turned toward the exit, my eyes locked onto the entrance. Preston had fled like a coward, practically running to his car to escape the humiliation. But he had not taken everyone with him. Standing just inside the threshold, lingering in the shadows near the deserted coat check, were Preston's furious, panicking parents. They had not stormed out to the valet line with the rest of the high society guests. They had stayed behind, remaining perfectly still in the dimly lit corridor. The absolute dread radiating from their rigid posture told me everything I needed to know. They were not looking at Vivian, and they were not looking at Chloe. They were looking directly at the leather portfolio in my hand. They realized that the forensic audit I held did not just expose Preston's fraudulent land deal. It contained the blueprint to completely dismantle the entirety of Vanguard Properties, and they were utterly terrified of what I was going to do next. I left Vivian sobbing into the expensive floorboards, her manicured hands clawing uselessly at the polished wood. I did not reach out to her. I did not offer her a hand. I simply looked down at the woman who had spent my entire life trying to make me feel small, and I watched her drown in the consequences of her own vanity. "You made your choice 17 years ago at that spa in Sedona," I reminded her, my voice devoid of a single ounce of empathy. "You made your choice every time you called me the family disappointment. You made your choice when you laughed with your friends and called me a lowly data entry clerk. You made your choice when you looked at me tonight and called me a charity case. You were so blinded by your own arrogance that you never bothered to look at who I actually became." I stepped back, putting physical distance between myself and her desperate reaching hands. "I highly suggest you turn to Chloe," I said coldly. "Ask your perfect daughter to use her impeccable golden child social skills to negotiate with your private lenders. Ask her to smile her way out of the millions in high-interest debt you just accrued, because I am not lifting a single finger to save you." I turned my back on her and shifted my attention entirely to the heavy mahogany doors at the entrance of the Magnolia Room. Preston had fled like a panicked child, leaving his fiancée to face the wreckage, but his parents had not managed to escape. They had frozen just inside the threshold, lingering in the shadows near the deserted coat check. The patriarch of Vanguard Properties. Arthur, a man who had spent the last 3 decades terrorizing local developers and bullying city zoning boards, now looked exactly like a cornered prey animal. His wife stood rigidly beside him, her fingers nervously twisting her diamond necklace until the heavy platinum chain dug into her skin. Their eyes were locked onto the heavy leather portfolio gripped in my right hand. They knew exactly what I was holding, and the sheer terror radiating from their stiff posture was palpable. I walked slowly toward them. My heels clicked against the hardwood floor with a rhythmic, measured cadence that echoed like a metronome counting down the final seconds of their corporate empire. I stopped exactly 3 feet away from them, invading their personal space, just enough to assert total physical and psychological dominance. The older man tried to straighten his shoulders, trying to summon the formidable, intimidating presence that usually made his subordinates cower, but his eyes betrayed him. He was sweating, small beads of perspiration gathering at his temples despite the heavy air conditioning of the country club. "You should have taught your son how to secure his own commercial financing instead of relying on a fake heiress to bail out your firm," I said, keeping my voice dangerously low and conversational. The quietness of my tone only amplified the threat. "But then again, he learned his predatory business practices directly from you, did he not?" I commissioned a full multi-tiered forensic audit of Vanguard Properties 2 months ago, right around the time I realized Vivian was trying to use my blind trust to buy her way into your family. I watched the last remaining traces of color completely drain from Arthur's face. His jaw tightened, but he remained silent, waiting for the executioner's blade to fall. "Your firm is a hollow, rotting shell." I continued stating the facts with surgical, merciless precision. "You are severely over-leveraged on 4 separate commercial developments in the downtown sector. To cover the bleeding, you have been illegally commingling funds, moving money from restricted escrow accounts to cover your daily operating expenses. That is not just poor management, Arthur. That is a massive federal violation. Your primary lenders have caught wind of the discrepancies, and are preparing to call in your notes by the end of this financial quarter. Vanguard Properties is exactly 30 days away from total catastrophic insolvency. His wife let out a sharp, terrified gasp, pressing both hands over her mouth to stifle a sob. Arthur opened his mouth to defend himself, to summon some bluster or hollow legal threat, but the words withered and died in his throat. He looked at my cold, unwavering expression and realized that his usual tactics of intimidation were entirely useless against me. I held all the cards. I held his entire legacy in the palm of my hand, and he knew I would not hesitate to crush it. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored jacket and withdrew a single business card. It was crafted from heavy matte black cardstock, featuring the sleek silver embossed logo of Apex Holdings. I did not hand it to him immediately. I held it between my fingers, letting the reality of our shifting power dynamic burn itself into his arrogant ego. "I am going to make you an offer," I said finally, extending the card toward his chest. He took it with a shaking hand, handling the small piece of paper as if it were radiating physical heat. "I will buy out Vanguard Properties' remaining viable assets. I will take the downtown developments the warehouse district permits, your commercial leasing contracts, and your entire portfolio of undeveloped land. But I am not paying market value. I am offering you exactly 12 cents on the dollar." His eyes widened in absolute shock. The sheer audacity of the number temporarily overrode his fear. 12 cents! He hissed, his voice trembling with outrage. "That is highway robbery. That will barely cover our immediate tax liabilities. We will be left with absolutely nothing." "You already have absolutely nothing," I corrected him sharply, my gaze turning to ice. "You just do not want to admit it to yourself yet. 12 cents on the dollar is a highly generous exit strategy. It is the only way you avoid defaulting on your primary bank loans. It is the only way you avoid a massive federal investigation by the Securities and Exchange Commission for mismanaging client escrow funds. You have two choices. You can take my buyout, quietly retire, and fade into obscurity. Or you can watch the federal government seize your assets, dismantle your firm, and put you in a federal penitentiary." I did not give him a chance to argue the point. I delivered the final non-negotiable terms. "You have until Monday morning at exactly 9 o'clock. My assistant will be at her desk waiting for your call. Do not try to negotiate. Do not try to stall or look for outside buyers. If the phone does not ring by 9:01, the offer is permanently revoked, and I will personally forward this entire forensic audit to the federal prosecutor's office." I calmly reached down and buttoned my tailored jacket. The sharp metallic click of the buttons sliding into place was the final punctuation mark on our interaction. The conversation was over. The business was concluded. I looked past the ruined executive and his weeping wife, taking in the full scope of the Magnolia Room one last time. The space was dead silent, save for the chaotic, pathetic sounds of emotional and financial destruction. Chloe was slumped against the far wall, her hysterical, breathless crying echoing off the crystal chandeliers. Her dream of becoming a billionaire socialite was dead, replaced by the crushing reality of impending debt collectors and public humiliation. Vivian was still on her knees in the center of the room, hyperventilating, struggling to pull oxygen into her lungs, as her fraudulent, carefully curated world collapsed inward on itself. I turned away from the Vanguard family and walked back through the center of the room. I walked past table 14. I walked past the towering, extravagant floral arrangements that no one was going to pay for. I walked directly past the grand head table. Resting on the pristine white tablecloth, ignored and discarded, was the quitclaim deed Vivian had tried to force me to sign. It sat there completely unsigned, a worthless piece of paper that represented the ultimate failure of their boundless greed. I did not even break my stride. I kept my head held high, my posture immaculate, walking straight past the ruins of their own making. I pushed through the heavy wooden doors of the country club, leaving the suffocating atmosphere of artificial wealth and toxic vanity behind me forever. I stepped out into the warm, humid Atlanta night. The air felt incredibly fresh in my lungs, carrying the faint scent of pine trees and distant summer rain. My personal driver was waiting by the curb, standing at attention beside the sleek black town car. He saw me approaching and immediately opened the rear door. I slid into the quiet, luxurious interior of the vehicle, the soft leather familiar and deeply comforting. "Take me home," I instructed softly. The car glided away from the curb, leaving the country club and my biological family in the rearview mirror. I watched the vibrant city lights of Atlanta blur past the tinted windows. I had not just survived their betrayal, I had conquered it. I leaned back into the seat and smiled in the dark, driving back to the real empire, the one I had built from the ground up with my own two hands. The ultimate lesson from this story is that your true worth is never defined by those who repeatedly fail to see it. Blood relations do not excuse toxic behavior, and a family should be built on mutual respect, not financial exploitation or manipulation. When those closest to you constantly underestimate and diminish your value, the best revenge is not vindictive destruction, but quiet, unwavering success. By silently building your own independent empire and fiercely protecting your boundaries, you strip toxic people of their power. Ultimately, karma is simply the natural consequence of their own greed, leaving you free to thrive. If you have ever had to walk away from a toxic environment to protect your peace and build your own success, share your story in the comments below and subscribe for more empowering journeys.